Today we'll recap a thriller movie, The Good Son. Subscribe and hit like before we begin. The day of playing soccer turns into Mark Evans' worst as his father arrives with a grim expression. Mark understands the situation. His frail mother Janice is in the hospital. When he visits her, she's sleeping and looks weak. Janice wakes up and asks why he didn't wake her, to which Mark responds that he thought she needed rest. Janice smiles weakly, admits she'd rather see him. She discusses her condition and reassures Mark that he will be okay. Janice reassures Mark that she will always be with him, but he struggles to accept the reality. He insists that she won't die because he won't allow it. On the day of the funeral, Mark isolates himself from the guests and his father. Meanwhile, Jack discusses his concerns with his brother Wallace, considering not leaving for a business trip and leaving Mark alone. Wallace convinces Jack that going to Tokyo might prevent him from leaving Mark again, and that it could be good for Mark to be around other kids. Jack agrees and plans to take Mark to Wallace's place in Maine to spend time together. During their journey to Wallace's house, Jack attempts to connect with Mark through teasing, but Mark's lack of response concerns Jack. He pulls over and opens up about his own pain, asking Mark not to shut him out. Mark remains in denial, insisting that his mother will return. Jack, while holding on to a glimmer of hope, acknowledges that Janice won't come back as herself. He urges Mark to accept her passing. This declaration deeply upsets Mark, prompting him to abruptly leave the vehicle and run into the desert. Along the way, something seems to strike Mark's thoughts, causing him to suddenly stop. Upon reaching Wallace's house, they're warmly greeted by Wallace and his daughter Connie. Susan, Wallace's wife, also welcomes them and remarks on the years since she last saw Mark. During their conversation, Connie's playful scream draws everyone's attention to her brother Henry, who's hanging upside down with a scary mask. Wallace calls Henry down, and he hands Mark a mask he made, symbolizing a brotherly connection. During dinner, Susan tells Jack that she arranged for Alice Davenport, a therapist who works with Wallace at the hospital, to talk to Mark while he's staying there. As they dine, Henry playfully engages with Mark by kicking his legs under the table, prompting laughter. The two continue their light-hearted interaction as Henry demonstrates how to crack a lobster shell, creating a jovial atmosphere. Susan quietly expresses her belief to Jack that Mark will be all right, and Jack agrees. After dinner, Jack starts to prepare to leave for Tokyo. He reassures Mark that this trip will be shorter and he won't have to leave him again. Jack emphasizes that it's only a 2-week trip and encourages Mark to enjoy his time with his cousins during his winter break. Mark hugs his father, and Jack promises they will reunite soon before driving away. The next day, Mark wakes up to the sound of Henry playing outside. He quickly gets dressed and joins his cousin. As he descends the stairs, he passes a child's room and takes a brief look inside before closing the door. Mark continues down the stairs, and when Susan notices him, she offers him breakfast. Susan expresses their happiness about Mark staying with them, and after Henry calls out to him, she allows him to join his cousin outside. Henry leads Mark to his treehouse, with Connie watching from below. As the boys climb the tree, Henry reaches the top first. When Mark is about to join him, he asks Henry for help, and as Henry tries to pull him up, a branch breaks, leaving Mark hanging from the tree while Henry holds on. Henry jokingly asks Mark if he thinks he can fly if he lets him go. Mark desperately asks for help until Henry manages to pull him safely into the treehouse. They lie down, catching their breath, and play around. Later, the boys explore an abandoned factory, playfully breaking windows until they're chased away by the caretaker. They find themselves in a cemetery where they discover a well. Henry uses it to hide his cigarettes and offers one to Mark, who declines, citing the health risks. Henry dismisses the concern, saying they'll die anyway. Mark struggles with the cigarette, causing him to cough. Henry asks Mark if he saw his mother after she passed away, and Mark's response reveals he wasn't allowed. Henry encourages Mark to insist on investigating the deceased, as people avoid the topic. He asks about Janice's appearance before her death, and Mark's description leads to Henry sharing his own experience with his dead brother's body turning blue. Mark demands that Henry stop discussing his mother, but Henry argues he's approaching it scientifically. Despite Mark's anger, Henry challenges him further and playfully suggests throwing him down a well, using his discarded cigarette metaphorically. Mark gazes down the well without fear, and Henry extends an apology for everything, expressing empathy for how Mark would feel without a mother. The boys reconcile by shaking hands. The next morning, as Mark and Henry walk along the dock, they're chased by a dog, prompting them to run frantically. They manage to close a door on the dog at the end of a bridge, but instead of leaving, Henry taunts the dog, which irritates Mark. After a brief exchange, Mark pulls Henry away from the dog. They move on to a cliff overlooking the sea, where Susan stands on the other side, lost in thought. Henry notes that Susan often comes here to reflect on her late son, Richard. He finds this a bit strange, and then invites Mark to his shed to reveal his latest invention. Henry shows Mark a makeshift crossbow. Mark asks for an explanation of its function, and Henry takes the crossbow outside to demonstrate by aiming at a cat. Mark helps load it and reminds Henry not to hit the cat, just scare it. Henry shoots and narrowly misses the cat, leaving Mark both amazed and Henry disappointed. One day, Mark visits Alice Davenport, the therapist mentioned by Susan. Reluctant at first, Mark eventually opens up to her about blaming himself for his mother's death, feeling he broke his promise to her. That night, he's disturbed by a noise from the corridor and sees a woman in white. Thinking it's his mother, he follows her downstairs, only to realize it's Susan. Mark sits on the stairs, expressing his belief that she came back, and that he somehow knew she would return. Mark confides in Susan, expressing his feelings about missing his mother. She comforts him with a hug, assuring him that she's there for him. Henry observes them from upstairs. Later, Mark and Connie are playing when Henry calls Mark to go outside. Henry has his makeshift crossbow and is looking for a target. He spots the dog that had chased them earlier and shoots it, shocking Mark with his accuracy. They find the dog dead and drop it into the well in the cemetery. As Henry hums a song, Mark leaves feeling disgusted. Looking at photos in the living area, Mark comes across a picture of his mother carrying him as a child. Susan joins him, and they talk about missing Richard, Mark's late brother. Henry interrupts and invites Mark to his shed, saying he has something to show him. Reluctantly, Mark joins Henry as Susan encourages him to do so. In the shed, Henry introduces Mark to a dummy named Mr. Highway. Mark questions Henry about his intentions, but Henry gives vague responses, saying it depends on Mark's involvement. Together, they take the dummy outside and Henry tosses it off a bridge, causing a major car accident. Henry watches the chaos with enjoyment while Mark is horrified by the wreckage. They flee to a tunnel to evade the police. Inside the tunnel, Mark confronts Henry, expressing his anger and concern about the potential harm caused. Henry coolly admits that he did it with Mark's assistance. Mark is shocked, explaining that he didn't anticipate Henry would actually throw the dummy off the bridge. Henry dismisses Mark's concerns, claiming that he pities him for not knowing how to have fun. He continues to express his philosophy about being free and flying, encouraging Mark not to fear. But Mark responds that Henry's behavior is sickening. That night, Mark listens to the news reporting on the car accident caused by the bridge incident. He contemplates informing Wallace about what happened but is taunted by Henry, who suggests that Wallace will believe him over Mark. Henry tries to force Mark into Wallace's office, but Mark escapes upstairs. When Wallace questions what's going on, Henry downplays Mark's behavior. Connie enters the room and tells them about plans to go skating the next day. Henry scolds Connie for entering his room, pinching her ear and making her cry. Mark intervenes, stopping the fight and telling Henry that Connie can stay. The boys begin physically fighting, and as Connie calls for help, Henry asks Mark if he would be sad if something happened to her. In a foreboding tone, Henry suggests that accidents occur and advises Mark to inquire about Richard from his mother. Susan enters the room, and Henry quickly spins a story that they're playing a harmless game. Mark supports this tale, and Susan believes them, leaving them be. The next day, Alice finds Mark at the playground as he watches Connie play. Mark admits he hasn't forgotten their appointment, but just doesn't feel like talking. He asks Alice about the nature of evil, and she explains that evil is often used when people can't understand someone's actions. Mark then inquires whether someone is considered evil if they do terrible things just because they enjoy them. Alice denies believing in inherent evil. Later, during dinner, Wallace instructs Mark and Henry to look after Connie while he takes Susan out. Henry manipulates the situation, suggesting that Mark wants to move into Richard's room since he seems to like it. Mark tries to deny this, but the adults are already engrossed in a discussion about whether Mark should switch to the little boy's room. Wallace suggests that Mark stay in Richard's room might be a good idea, but Susan disagrees, not feeling ready for that change. Despite Wallace's persuasion, Susan is firm about keeping Richard's room untouched. During the argument, Mark tries to tell them that Henry is making things up. Susan leaves the table upset, leaving Henry satisfied. He watches his mother cry in Richard's room, where he goes to comfort her. While Susan and Wallace are out at a restaurant, the kids play hide and seek by turning off the lights in the house. Connie hides, and Henry finds her first. When Connie screams, Mark rushes to find her and sees Henry playfully tickling her. Mark offers to read a story instead, which Connie agrees to. After reading her a story, Mark sleeps in Connie's room to protect her from Henry. The next morning, Mark wakes up to find Connie's bed empty. He overhears Susan and Wallace talking about Richard, and Susan blames herself for his drowning. She recalls leaving him alone in the tub with very little water to answer the phone. Wallace offers to take Connie to the Andersons, but Susan informs him that Connie went skating with Henry at Miller's Pond. Upon hearing this, Mark hurries to Miller's Pond. The pond is crowded with skaters, and Mark navigates the icy surface without skates. slipping and bumping into people as he searches. He spots the siblings and rushes to them. Despite not having skates, Mark keeps moving determinedly. Henry leads Connie to a restricted pond area and pushes her onto thin ice, causing her to fall into the water. A crowd gathers, and Henry pretends to help while keeping Mark away. Only when Connie begins to sink do people intervene by breaking the ice to rescue her. With Henry watching, Susan rushes to the hospital, where Wallace reassures her about Connie's condition. Mark tells Susan that Henry pushed Connie onto the ice, and that Henry admitted to trying to harm her. Susan becomes upset and slaps Mark, defending Henry. Later that night at the hospital, Henry enters Connie's room and attempts to take a pillow while Susan catches him. He claims concern for his sister and maintains that the incident was accidental. Later, Mark talks to his father on the phone, revealing Henry's actions regarding the dog and Connie. Jack is shocked and advises Mark to speak to his therapist. Mark goes to Alice's house, where he confronts Henry's manipulative stories. He gets upset and leaves. Henry continues to spread false stories about Mark. After a session with Alice, Henry taunts Mark in the treehouse, and Mark asserts that the truth will come out. Despite Henry's attempts to manipulate the situation, Henry warns Mark, but Mark stands his ground. That night, Mark searches the kitchen for food and discovers Henry there, implying he's poisoned it. Henry calls his parents, who find Mark disposing of the food, claiming Henry poisoned it. Susan calms Mark and Wallace takes him to Richard's room. The next day, Susan finds Richard's rubber duck in Henry's shed. Henry arrives and claims it was his before Richard's. He takes the duck and goes to the cemetery to drop it in the well. Later, Henry hints at plans to hurt his mother, unsettling Mark. Mark threatens Henry with scissors, but Wallace enters and intervenes before Mark can do anything. Wallace confines Mark in the study room, but Mark escapes through a window to see Henry leading Susan into the woods. Mark flees, witnessing from a distance as Henry confronts Susan. Henry's evasive answers lead Susan to question if he killed Richard. Henry becomes agitated, claiming he'd rather die than be sent away. Henry pushes Susan off a cliff, but she grabs onto a branch. Mark arrives and tackles Henry. Susan pulls herself up and grabs both boys' hands. As Susan struggles to hold on, she can't save both boys. With her strength waning, she chooses to save Mark, and Henry falls to his death. Susan hugs Mark, reflecting on the choice she had to make. Mark wonders if Susan would make the same choice again, but he's certain he'll never ask her. Well, what an evil little child that Home Alone kid turned out to be. I'll admit that the actor did a really good job at being an asshole. What did you guys think of the movie? I'm glad Frodo saved the day once again.
Subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on notifications and leave a like. It really helps the channel.